Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Lembitrago, and I am the Secretary General for the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. I am now going to give some introductory words to the webinar we have today. So I'm trying to put on my slides. Thank you. First, I would like to give you some words about the CIOMS, Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. CIOMS was founded in 1949 by WHO and UNESCO. It is in official relations with WHO, it is UNESCO associated partner, and since 2016 it is also ICH Observe. CIOMS' mission is to advance public health through guidance on health research, including ethics, medical product development, and safety. CIOMS is a membership organization. CIOMS has international, national, and associate members. Amongst international members, there are big international organizations such as World Medical Association, which is an umbrella organization for all medical doctors from all countries all around the world. But there are also more specific medical science organizations like International Society of Pharmacovigilance or International Society of Pharmacoepidemiology or International Union of Basic and Clinical Pharmacology among CIOMS member organizations. Among national member organizations, there are several medical academies and also some national clinical research councils. CIOMS has three major areas of work. First, bioethics, second, pharmacovigilance, and third, product development. Of course, sometimes it's difficult to put the CIOMS working group report under only one of these major areas. Some, of course, are covering several areas at the same time. But here in this slide, we have some examples from the recent past about the CIOMS reports. As of end of 2022, CIOMS had 7 active working groups. First, MEDRA labeling groupings. Second, benefit risk balance for medicinal products, CIOMS working group 12. Third, real-world data and real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making, CIOMS working group 13. Fourth, severe cutaneous adverse reactions, SCARS. Fifth, recommended standards of education and training for health professionals in participating in medicines development. 6, working group on good governance for research institutions in the area of bioethics. And last, 7th, artificial intelligence in pharmacovigilance, CIOMS working group 14. Several of these mentioned working groups are approaching to the end, which means that they are getting in this year, 2023, ready for publishing the reports. Now, this webinar is dedicated to introducing the new CIOMS report, patient involvement in the development, regulation, and safe use of medicines. This report is clearly a milestone and a very comprehensive textbook, you could call it, giving an overview how patient involvement in the development, regulation, and safe use of medicine could actually make the world better, having better medicines available for the patients globally. Now, how we do the webinar. First, we will have 2 distinguished speakers, and after the speakers, we have moderated panel discussion. All the speakers the moderator, and the panelists are members of the CIOMS working group 11 that produced the report we are going to talk about today. So it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First, Dr. Elizabeth Orlin, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Applied Patient Experience LLC, and also she's former assistant vice president for research and education in National Health Council of US. And the second distinguished speaker is Dr. Manal Yunus, head of Iraqi National Pharmacovigilance Center, and also a board member of the International Society of Pharmacovigilance, ISOP, which is also CIOMS, one of the CIOMS member organizations. She is also a well-known speaker in many conferences and meetings dedicated to the medicine safety and pharmacovigilance. And after the two speakers who will introduce you this new CIOMS working group report, we will have a panel discussion moderated by Professor Peter Pitts, President and co-founder Center for Medicine in the Public Interest in the United States. So thank you for listening my little introduction, and now over to our speakers and moderator to continue. And of course, in the end, if we have time, we'll try to, as much as possible, also answer to your questions. So please be prepared to have also questions for the panelists. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce everybody to our book, Patient Involvement in the Development, Regulation, and Safe Use of Medicines during today's webinar. I'll be introducing chapters 1 through 5 before I turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Manal Yunus. The book is set up like a textbook, so instead of focusing or attempting to cover all the material, I'm going to describe topics that are covered and also present a couple of highlights for each of these chapters. And really the focus is going to be on helping readers to understand where to look for information about certain topics. But before I jump in, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the many folks who contributed language, examples, documents, their time over the past couple of years as we were developing the book. And so their names are written here and then on the slide as well. So really pleased to be able to present on everybody's behalf today. And really delighted to have been able to work with this group over the past couple of years. So let us jump right in. Again, I'm going to be covering chapters 1 through 5, which will be the introduction, landscape, guiding principles, advancing treatments, and then use of real-world data and evidence. And just as a reminder, you can download a free copy of the book on CIOMS's website if you want to follow along during the presentation as well. So to start off, I wanted to provide a little bit of an introduction to the terminology that's going to be really important to understanding the context of the book. So when we talk about the patient community, that's a broad term, an umbrella term that encompasses the individual patients, family caregivers, as well as organizations that represent them. So it might be a patient advocacy organization, patient group, patient organization. There's lots of different words, but really when we're talking about patient community, it's this group of people who are working on behalf of patients or are patients themselves. And then when we refer to a patient, it's a person who has or had a health condition, whether or not they currently receive therapy to prevent or treat it. And then we've adapted these definitions from the National Health Council and the Food and Drug Administration. And then also a couple of other important definitions, patient-focused drug development, which is really the focus of the entire book. It's a systematic approach to capture patients' experiences, perspective, needs, and priorities, and to incorporate them meaningfully into the development and evaluation of a medicinal product throughout its life cycle. So we'll be diving deeper into that during today's conversation. And then finally, the book is called Patient Involvement. What does that mean? So in the US, it's often called patient engagement, but it's synonymous with patient involvement. And so we adopted a definition that was developed by ISPOR's patient-centered interest group, which is that patient engagement and research refers to the active, non-tokenistic, and collaborative interaction between patients, the patient community, and other stakeholders, where decision-making is guided by patients' contributions as partners, recognizing their unique experiences, values, and expertise. So really important here is that for it to be meaningful, patient engagement decisions should ideally be guided by contributions that we're asking patients and patient representatives and caregivers to help us with throughout the life cycle. So now jumping into the first chapter, this is the introduction chapter, and this is really going to be helping us to understand what is the scope of the book and what's beyond the scope of this book. And so, primarily throughout the chapters, you'll see that there's a focus on interactions between patients, patient advocates, drug developers, regulatory authorities, and healthcare professionals. And other stakeholders are, of course, involved, especially HTA bodies and payers. However, the focus of this book is really on patients' involvement in the development, regulation, and safe use of medicines, and we're focusing primarily on those 4 stakeholder groups. And so you'll see them referenced throughout, and this is just a introductory figure highlighting how a medicine may progress to marketing authorization, and then how different stakeholders contribute to that effort. And I do want to make note that HTA and patient involvement HTA has been hugely influential on how the field has evolved, and we didn't focus on it for this book because there's a sister book actually that HTAI's Patient and Citizen Involvement Group has developed that's specifically about that topic. So we've referenced that and encourage folks to take a look at that complementary book as well. So then the second half of this book is really going to be focused on post-authorization. So once a product has been approved by a regulatory body and it's now able to get to individual patients post-marketing, post-authorization. And so what we're thinking about in the post-authorization phase is, how well does the medicine actually address patients' needs? What are maybe new concerns, unmet needs that arise? And then also, how can we help patients to minimize any risks? And so that's going to be primarily the second half of the book, where we're talking about more of the post-authorization phase, although certainly principles that we introduce will be relevant throughout. So the second chapter, if you're interested in learning more about the history of patient engagement, where did patient engagement in drug development come from? What are some of the sort of events? What types of conversations were folks having maybe 10, 15 years ago? Where are the roots of patient advocacy and so on? And how has that all kind of led to where we are today, where the focus really is on patient centricity and patient engagement in drug development. So we highlight how patient organizations came to be, the HIV/AIDS activism, and what the rest of the patient community also learned and benefited from from their activism, as well as the rare disease patient advocacy communities. And then we get into a little bit more about patient centricity in medicine development, how in the early 2000s, late 90s, started focusing more on patient involvement in identifying what are the outcomes, what concepts matter to patients, and making sure that those were guided by patient involvement, and how that sort of movement led us to a guidance from FDA that was about patient involvement in identifying what should be measured as part of clinical trials, as well as other initiatives that were going on around the world. We highlight these topics around, once many in the community had decided it's important for us to do a better focus on meeting the needs of patients and finding out directly from patients what are those needs. What were some of the barriers that were preventing interested parties in advancing in that area? And so that includes regulatory and legal uncertainty, culture, as well as some communication barriers. And so this chapter introduces what some of those challenges are, and then also what's happened since then. What are some of the guidances that have come out? What type of actions have happened across different countries? And also what kinds of frameworks have evolved. So definitely, if that's something of interest, there's quite a bit in there, as well as some case examples. And then we also highlight examples of how patients have been engaged in the safe use of medicines. So encourage you to take a look at those examples in this chapter. And one other really cool part of this chapter that I think you might be interested in is that we highlight a number of real-world examples of how patient involvement has contributed to the development and safe use of medicines. For example, patient trade-offs between effectiveness and safety, patients' views on convenience, patient input into formulation and packaging. We also present PMDA from Japan's approach to patient engagement, as well as some examples from the European Medicines Agency, their pharmacovigilance risk assessment committee, and how patients contributed to the valproate risk minimization program in 2017. So a really nice safety example that includes patients helping with guiding decisions, and then also examples from Health Canada. So I recommend take a look at that. Perhaps you're already familiar with some of them, but I'm sure some of them are new. And the idea is that this might be able to help spur some ideas of how patients could also contribute to your own work, as well as potentially helping you drive culture change with some good case examples from other regions, if that's an objective. So here's just some of the key points from the chapter on the landscape. Next, we move into chapter 3, and these are the guiding principles, which are really pulled throughout the book. And it's important to note here that these are guiding principles for involving patients throughout the drug development life cycle. And the focus on developing these guiding principles was really looking at what information is already out there from other organizations that are working in this space, best practices that have been published by groups like PFMD, WeCan, National Health Council, and so on and so forth. And so the group that focused on developing this chapter did a really nice review at the beginning to make sure that we were, really presenting a consensus of what not only work group members are thinking, but the broader community that's focused and has developed significant time and resources to the space and best practices. So within this particular chapter, what you'll find is there are guiding principles with an introduction, and then there's also, in many cases, a set of skills that might be relevant to making that guiding principle actually real, make it happen in a specific setting. So here's an example of training stakeholders for patient engagement activities, and that it's really important to train all the stakeholders who are going to be contributing. It's not just training patients about, you know, what's regulatory decision making look like, or you know, what's a clinical trial look like, but also about training regulatory staff as well as industry staff and others about how to use the information and best practices for engaging people on those types of topics. In addition, we refer to resources, external resources, where you can learn more. Potentially, there's already a resource that has been developed that might meet your needs. For example, UPATI has their entire training that's an excellent resource for folks to look at. Eurordis, many other initiatives are linked to. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you're thinking about doing a training in your organization, or are interested in exploring additional guiding principles for patient involvement. Here are just a couple of, again, key points about the guiding principles, really emphasizing that patients offer very valuable perspectives and that it should guide decision-making. It's different than the input provided by other stakeholders. They're experts in their disease and condition, and that gives them credibility as scientific, as much credibility certainly on that topic, probably more, I would say, about what it's like to actually live with a disease or disability. And so, you know, it's really important that that patients are equal partners in any patient engagement activity and don't feel like they're not able to make a meaningful contribution. Also, we cover reimbursement of expenses and compensation for patients' time and contributions, and link to a couple of other resources that have been developed on this topic. Training, also maintaining independence of patients and patient groups, and then providing transparent and open communication. The next chapter is about advancing treatments, and this is a really comprehensive chapter. There's a lot of really good information in here, and this provides information about opportunities for patient input to guide medicine's development. For example, some of the topics covered in here would be how do you select a patient-centered outcome or a patient-relevant outcome? How can you work with patients to identify that? How can patients maybe contribute to designing a clinical trial that's more accessible? Reducing burden or procedures, how patients can help you meet your recruitment goals, and also design a trial that that collects the information that you'll want to be collecting, and that patients certainly need you to be collecting to help inform their own decisions about treatments as well. We have here, again, a nice example of key roles for each of the four main stakeholders that I had mentioned earlier. And so these are some examples across the life cycle that I encourage you to take a look at. Then we also have some best practices carrying forth from the third chapter about how to engage. There's some examples of resources that are already out here, out there. This is examples from Paradigm, Prefer, and Protect, which were large multi-stakeholder initiatives that have produced really great reports over the last couple of years and handbooks. So encourage you to take a look at this chapter really for implementing patient involvement. There's also resources to help you think through how you might want to collect patient experience data, how you could, learn about patients' experiences and unmet needs. So we link to some resources that are publicly available for you to actually use in your own research. And then we also have information here about patient engagement in patient preference studies. I mentioned IMI Prefer earlier, and here are some best practices and conclusions that came out of that 5-year project. So again, really the focus is on consolidating information from various resources and making that accessible to folks. There's also some really nice examples of what this looks like in different countries. Here, this is a section about patient engagement and regulatory review. This is a model from PMDA in Japan of how they involve patients. And so this might be of interest, particularly to our audience in Asia Pacific region. We also have an example of patient involvement in medicine life cycle at EMA. How are they engaging patients across the medicine's life cycle? And so, you can take a look at this. This is also in the 4th chapter. And, just a couple of key themes, again, emerging out of the 4th chapter, that there's a lot of people who are involved, lots of different stakeholders. And this chapter provides some insights about how they might be engaged. Stakeholders are, diverse. They include healthcare professionals, sponsors, biotech, regulators, as well as payers. And that it's, there's really a huge number of opportunities in terms of engaging patients. So now I'm just about out of time, so I wanted to just quickly highlight the 5th chapter, which is about real-world data and evidence. And again, real-world data, that's information collected during patients' routine interaction with healthcare services. And so this chapter focuses on how can patients be engaged in thinking through which real-world data to collect, as well as some other special topics about methodologies for collecting real-world data. So, one of the topics covered is about data ownership, and there's some examples of work that patient groups have done in this space. Finally, just, some key points is that there's lots of opportunities to advance this space. This is sort of the next frontier, I think, in terms of patient involvement. Although many patient groups have had registries for many years, that would be a type of real-world data. Patient involvement and actually designing studies is something that's a little bit newer. And we need to think about data security, privacy, and so on and so forth as we're advancing that. So I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Duke-NUS, to continue and take us through the second half of the book. Thank you.
First, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity and Dr. Lambert for the introduction. Thank you, Elizabeth, for nicely presenting the increasing importance of engaging patients in vast activities throughout the life cycle of the medicines and shedding some light on the current trends of patient engagement. My name is Madam Mohammed Yunus. I'm the head of the Iraq Pharmacovigilance Center. Also, I'm an International Society of Pharmacovigilance Advisory Board member. I will cover in the next 20 minutes or so second part of the CIOMS Working Group 11 consensus report. I will walk you through several chapters, starting from chapter 6 to chapter 11. Each chapter focuses on different aspects related to the patient involvement in product labeling, in development and communication of urgent patient safety communication, and the design, development, and implementation of additional risk minimization measures, and developing treatment guidelines, obstacles to their involvement in remote and deprived communities, and the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the voice of the patients. Starting with chapter 6 of the CIOMS Working Group 11 report. This chapter provides helpful background on the currently available sources of the drug benefit risk information for patients and the effort underway to improve the quality of the patient labeling. This chapter also provides a set of recommended principles for the patient engagement and development of patient labeling. The group set 3 important principles for patient engagement and the development of patient labeling. starting with the design of the patient label, where the participation should not be limited to the initial development of the labeling, but subsequent updates as well. The second principle covers patients' feedback on the acceptability and feasibility of the patient labeling material and ways to improve the labeling, and to determine if the patients have actually received the information, whether they have read it, whether it is understood, and whether they are able to act on the information. Patients are included in the evaluation of the effectiveness of patient labeling information. Not to mention, for each principle, there are several methodologies and approaches to choose from. Now, moving from patient labeling, that might take some quite time, to time-sensitive communication and ways to involve patients in such communication. Such involvement could be challenging but possible. A variety of patients, including those taking well-known and commonly used proprietary products or generic products, as well as those taking part in the clinical trials, may be impacted by such safety communication. So patient organization can play a role in improving the spread of safety information for such conditions using their network. Now, some key points for rapid safety communication. First, setting criteria for identifying safety issues for time-sensitive communication with patients. So it is important, to set these kind of criteria, and also choosing what information needs to be conveyed urgently for the patient, from the patient's perspective. Also, distributing time-sensitive safety information through the communication channels of patients' organizations is crucial. In addition to answering, addressing inquiries, and facilitating discussions concerning the safety communication among members of the patient organizations. Added to that, the importance of early engagement of patients in the process of giving feedback using established procedures, and also enhancing access by offering feedback on the facts and language used, and finally contributing to the plain language translation and to the creation of a glossary of terms related to a particular disease and its medications. For Chapter 8, the additional risk minimization measures, which are occasionally required because routine risk minimization measures may not be adequate to manage the risk associated with some medications. So these additional risks are usually targeting a specific risk or a group of risk, and maybe targeting a specific audience, such as patients, physicians, nurses, or pharmacists. And in this chapter, there will be a description of ways in which patients can be involved, not only in the design, development, and implementation of additional RIMS, but also in other aspects of RIMS, including when and how to involve patients if we are working as regulators or as market authorization holders, with examples, and to end up the chapter with failure modes and effects analysis for risk minimization. This slide presents the table of a question based on the general patient treatment pathway to obtain patient perspective. As you can see, based on each stage of the care pathway, patients might be asked their opinion on a variety of issues, starting with their opinion of the treatment selection, product dispensing, product use, and follow-up to inform the function and purpose of an additional RIMS. In order to improve the design of the additional RIMS for various medical products, information gathered from caregivers based on the pathway would also be helpful. Now, here are some of the key points regarding the additional REMS. Every medicine, as we know, is associated with some risk of harm to the patient. Some risks require additional measures. The measures need to be proportionate to the relevant risk, since they will put a burden on both the patient and the healthcare system. Hence, careful design is crucial for the additional REMS to fit easily into the healthcare system. Finally, patients should be part of each step of the process so that they could be part of the whole process. In Chapter 9, we will go through an overview of the clinical practice guideline and definitions, a description of various strategies for patients and public stakeholders' involvement in the guideline work, opportunities for patient involvement in their successful recruitment to these guidelines. Also, this chapter addresses considerations related to training and supporting patient involvement. Finally, managing conflict of interest and issues related to the value and impact of patient engagement in clinical guideline development. As you can see, this figure shows patient and public involvement during guideline development, where at all the stages of the guideline development, patients or public representatives can offer pertinent insights, and they can have an impact on the guidelines dissemination and implementation. Planning methodologies and patient feedback in accordance with the requirement of the guideline topic, scope, and purpose is crucial, while the development process is just getting underway. Some key points for the clinical practice guidelines. A high-quality clinical practice guideline must involve patients and the general public. A successful process for engagement guarantees that patients and members of the public can express their opinions, and the guideline takes their opinions into account. The principal steps for involving patients and members of the public in the guideline development process are patients and members of the public should be informed about the guideline for making health decisions. Their opinions should be gathered from a large number of patients or members of the public, and they should be invited to join the group that develops the guideline. There are various approaches to effectively include patients and the public. The goal and resources of the guideline determines the direction to choose. And to ensure that patients can openly express their opinion, effective mechanisms for recruiting and assisting patients or the general public are essential. The hiring procedures should be open, and the selecting process should adhere to the predetermined standards. Chapter 10 describes how the burden of both communicable and non-communicable diseases is higher in low and lower middle income countries compared to higher income countries. And their health systems frequently fall short of expectations or are ineffective, Also, a list of various difficulties that patients in low and middle income countries face, which also have an impact on their capacity for engagement or lack thereof. This chapter also offers suggestions for enhancing patient involvement in these contexts and describes ongoing initiatives in low and middle income countries. Some key points for Chapter 10. The principle for involving patients in low and middle income countries should be the same as those applied in high income countries. And addressing the specific challenges in low and middle income countries that hinder the full involvement of patients in the development, regulation, and safe use of medicine is important. Civil society, people working in medicine, research and development, governments, international institutions, and non-governmental organizations can all support the patient involvement in low and middle income countries. Several actions can improve patient involvement in low and middle-income countries, like, for example, improving health literacy, using a plain language in communication, developing laws and policies that guarantee fully involving the participation of patients, exchange of success stories, respect patients' needs through enforcing highest ethical standards for research, and engaging and learning from and with international patient organizations can also be helpful. On this slide, we are covering the pandemic consideration. Since it is evident that COVID-19 and its variants will not be totally eradicated, given the degree of the vaccine hesitancy and the risk they pose, we have to learn to live with them and adapt our strategies accordingly. For a variety of reasons, decision-making in times of crisis sometimes becomes centrally with little public input. During this pandemic, established patients and community advisory groups were frequently suspended, which prevented patients from providing feedback on crisis management strategies. On the other hand, patients' organizations remained active during the pandemic despite the overload, providing information, updates, support for their members, drawing attention to injustices and gathering detailed information on how the pandemic affected patients. Future pandemic management objective must include a roadmap that our children and grandchildren can follow, modify, and add to when new information becomes available. Finally, the appendices, which made up the final section of this report, included case studies to illustrate numerous cases of patients' participation in collaboration with other stakeholders such as regulatory agencies, marketing authorization holders, and other agencies. Final words, patient involvement gives patients and citizens a voice in the assessment of medicines and empowers them to express their opinion on issues related to the safety of particular medications, the management of risk, and beyond. And with that, I would like to say thank you to all for your kind attention, and over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Lembit and colleagues. I think what's important to remember as we go into this panel is that the idea of this report is that patients should be involved throughout the life of a medicine, from development through regulation to ongoing use in everyday healthcare. It describes where we are and a path to where we need to go. Most importantly, this is not a communications department exercise. This is an enterprise-wide responsibility, whether you are a patient organization or a pharmaceutical company, an academic, a pharmacist. Everybody has to be involved in this process for it to work. Winston Churchill said, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist sees an opportunity in every difficulty." The patient voice is not a passive voice. There are going to be difficulties, but there are tremendous opportunities. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to turn directly to our panel, and I'd like to start, Keza, with you. Could you please introduce yourself, and let me tee up a question for you. How can patient organizations use this new CIOMS report?
Well, thank you, Peter, for the question. So my name is Kaisa Immonen, and I represent here the European Patients Forum, which is a European-wide umbrella patient organization. We have a community of almost 80 members representing all kinds of disease areas. Many of our members work in research. They're interested in clinical trials. We've shared the new book with all of our members, and we hope that they can use it as a reference and as an advocacy tool in their interactions with research partners. We also have policy relevance in Europe for this at the moment, as we're looking forward to a wholesale revision of the EU pharmaceutical legislation. And we will use this guide to help us to get an understanding of how we can embed the patient voice throughout the future legislation. So that's just two things that we will be using the book for. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. I guess it's also good news that the timing of the report makes that even more plausible. So thank you very much. Marilyn, I'd like to pose the next question to you. So let me ask you the question, and then you can introduce yourself and respond to it. What factors do you think are important in understanding patients' needs for medicines?
Thanks for that. I'm Marilyn Metcalf. I work in patient engagement at GlaxoSmithKline. And to me, our first priority is really to listen. It's too easy when we're working in healthcare to focus on the questions that we think we can answer and then assume that those are the important questions. But in reality, patients are telling us over and over that diseases affect many aspects of their lives. And we may not be able to address all of those concerns, but as a first step, we need to hear the challenges that patients will face when they are navigating healthcare systems, accessing information, making treatments fit into their lives when they need to, and we need to focus our attention on making those experiences for them as easy as possible. I really don't see how else we can expect to improve adherence and effectiveness rates if we can't make the medicines really accessible to patients where they live. So we need to understand the barriers that we can help move in order for the patients as partners to be able to access those treatments.
I certainly agree with that. Thank you so much. Juan, let me come to you next. EMA has experience over many years in involving patients in medicines regulation. What would you recommend to other regulatory authorities who are starting to involve patients in their activities? Obviously, in the US and Europe, and we've been doing this for a while, and I don't want to suppose that West is always best, but what type of recommendations would you offer to other regulatory authorities?
Thank you very much. And my name is Juan García Burgos, and I'm head of public and stakeholder engagement at the agency. And I have been working in patient engagement for almost 18 years. So thank you for this question. And I would say that when giving some kind of recommendation, and because as you say, it's true that maybe we have been involved for more time with that, is that it's a long journey. It's not something that happens overnight, one day. It implies a culture, a change in the culture of the organization, in the way that people behave. And I think you have to sustain the effort over many years. So, I mean, one advice we will give is that you need to trust that patients will definitely add value to any activity in which you involve them. And I can say that after so many years involving them, that it is always the case. Patients always add something to the discussion. And I think this is the main factor which converts everyone internally in the organization and facilitate that you systematically introduce patient engagement. And the other aspect is that if you want patient engagement to happen, you need to institutionalize. You need to have a dedicated function in the organization which is doing it. Otherwise, we are all so busy that we never have the time to think that patients should be involved there. So maybe these are my two main messages to recommend anyone who wants to engage in this.
Meredith, let me turn to you. What are the key principles of patient engagement when it comes to something such as patient labeling, such a crucial piece of educational opportunity?
Thanks, Peter. Hi, I'm Dr. Meredith Smith. I'm Senior Director, Implementation Science in the Patient-Centered Research Group at Evidera, a healthcare research consultancy. I think there's three major principles of patient engagement and patient labeling. And like you say, it is really, really critical to have that patient involvement. The first principle is really about involving patients in the decisions around the content and the formatting of the labeling information. And that can be done in a variety of ways, such as co-creation or interviews, crowdsourcing, focus groups. The second principle is really to include patients in the iterative testing of the initial draft of that labeling material, pilot testing, to really understand if it's comprehensible, if patients find it useful, they can act on the information. And then lastly, engage patients in the evaluation of that patient labeling material once the product is on the market in that kind of post-authorization period when the labeling is being distributed and made available. And you want to understand from them at that point if patients can really, did they receive the labeling? Did they understand it? Were there aspects of it that were clear or not clear? And then how they were able to use it.
Stella, let me move to you next. Where do you think patients can add value when trying to reduce the risks of a medicine through existing or additional risk minimization measures?
Thank you, Peter. I'm Stella Blackburn. I'm Vice President, Strategic Operations at IQVIA. There are so many areas in risk minimization where patients can add value, but I will confine myself to just two. Communication is one of the most frequently used tools in risk minimization, and it is a critical area where patient input will be immensely valuable. Patients can provide advice on what the key things are that a patient needs to know about a medicine to use it safely. They can suggest what the most appropriate format is for education material. They can suggest wording and also test out draft prototypes to see how understandable they are and what could be improved. The second one is many companies have global risk minimization programs, and patients can play a key role in adapting these for the local country with information on what might work, might not work, and what is culturally acceptable, because unless something is agreeable to patients and they want to use it, it's not going to work. So thank you, Peter.
Christine, let me move to you next. How can Big Pharma uncover ways to keep patients at the heart of the clinical trial process?
Thank you, Peter, for the question. So I'm Christine Sturschler. I work at Novartis in patient engagement. And your question actually is really directly related to my daily job. So I think the most important when you want to really retain patients in clinical trials is to collaborate very early with patients and patient organizations to really understand the patient life experience, what it means to live with the disease. And only patients are experts and they can tell us, and I really learn a lot from them. Then with this knowledge, you can develop your clinical development plans and also your protocols. So the second step, I would say, is really crucial to collaborate with patients as research partners, that together we co-create the material for the clinical trials, like the protocol, the informed consent forms, all the educational material which will be then reaching the study population. And lastly, I think while the participant is already recruiting the clinical trial, it's really important that the sponsors with the patients as research partners proactively worked on solutions to decrease the burden of the participation. And the solutions can be multiple. We can have, for example, decentralized clinical trial solutions. We can maybe work on reimbursement compensation fees to really propose solutions to decrease the budget or the financial burden. Getting also feedback from the patients on how they feel in the course of a clinical trial through a survey, a questionnaire that we can then take back and reflect on are all different ways to really increase the retention of patients in clinical trials. So I think we should not forget that without patients as research partners, patients participating in clinical trials, there won't be any innovative medical new drugs. So it's so important to keep them at the heart of clinical trials. Thank you, Peter.
Elizabeth, let me move to you next. How will the new CIOMS report help to advance engaging patients, including collecting PRO, patient-reported outcomes, or other types of non-traditional clinical trial data?
Sure. So I think that the first couple of chapters that outline what the expectations are for patient centricity around identifying what is patient-centered, what's a patient-centered outcome, what's a patient-centered, what's an experience that patients care about that we should be collecting data on as part of clinical trials. We also in the CIOMS guidance talk a little bit about real world evidence and how can we make sure that the real world data that's being collected is responsive to the needs of patients when it comes to things like data privacy, but then also when it comes to the type of data and the concepts within the data that we're collecting. And so I think it offers a lot of really great suggestions that really bring together the best practices from across different organizations that have been, having multi-stakeholder collaborations over the past 10 years or so to set the expectations for that patient engagement when determining concepts of interest, if we're thinking about an outcome assessment, or if we're thinking about additional experience data that we might want to collect, making sure that we're really targeting it about the things that matter to patients, the things that impact their experiences with treatment and with living with a disease as well.
Sure. Last but certainly not least, Manal, let me turn to you. We mentioned earlier that this is not, strictly speaking, do it the way the West does and stop giving me your advice. This is not a West is best proposition. Everybody has to create opportunities for patients in their own way, in their own nations, in their own cultures, in their own best practices. So Manal, my question is, how can limited resources settings start implementing patient engagement?
Thank you so much, Peter. To answer this question, Peter, I think first it should not be much different from what is going on the West. I think we need first to understand the environment that we need the patient to be involved in, whether it is a regulatory, a clinical, or a research environment. And I believe that the first step is to establish a baseline of this understanding by piloting the setting, the people working in the setting, the processes, the patients, and later on, that we will have a better communication, a better understanding of the patient needs and the skills that should be improved. And after that, we could begin building on these next steps. So besides this, I think that also overcoming different barriers related to communication, health literacy, as you mentioned, and the trust are essential. Starting where others stop and learning from other experiences also is a good way to go. And at top of all of this, legislation should also require patients' organizations to participate in decision making at different levels, of course, and to ensure a meaningful patient involvement. I think legislation needs to be strongly, enforced at the low resources setting. And with that, I would like to hand it over to you again. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Manal. The very, very keen concepts. I think one thing that keeps coming up, and you've said it very well, is that while it's important to learn from other people's experiences, it's important to customize and also to pilot. We can't all just jump in and expect it to be wholly birthed or, Athena coming out of the head of Zeus. That we'll simply have to learn what works by piloting projects and seeing what works best and being elastic and flexible. One question I'd like to pick up on is this huge paradigm shift we're talking about. Initially, in years past, we talked about what we can learn, what patients can learn from us. And I think that what this report is trying to communicate is it's equally important to understand what we can learn from patients, we being the broad healthcare ecosystem. Manal just talked about piloting projects, and I think one of the key takeaways there is we need to move incrementally forward and learn what works so we can further develop best practices. One question still, and I'd like to toss this to you, is when it comes to issues such as risk management, clearly important to everybody. When you're in our business, when you have a advanced degree, when you know what the big words mean, when you can define the acronyms, every piece of information is crucial. And that when we begin talking about sharing less information, truncating the way it's presented, scientists will say, what? We're going to improve this by giving people less information? And clearly, there are dynamics there relative to health literacy that makes that important to understand. But let me ask you specifically, when it comes to risk management, the way it's presented now versus potentially moving forward in a more abbreviated, user-friendly, plain language way, is this going to help or is it going to hinder by not giving somebody the opportunity to look at vast amounts of information?
Thank you very much, Peter. And I think we all know that when we get given vast amounts of information, you don't tend to take it in. So what is really important when doing education materials or other forms of risk minimization is to make the language understandable. In fact, brevity is preferable to downloading a great tome of information. And we can start doing that in our clinical trial processes. I mean, we have patients who've been participating in clinical trials, and they are incredibly valuable. They can tell us what information was helpful what information wasn't helpful? What do they think are the key things that a patient needs to know? If they've been using devices to, say, example, measure doses, how was it? Did it work for them? And so I think that everybody can do this because we all have clinical trials with patient participants. Talk to the patients, find out what their experience was and how things can be improved and what was good and what was bad.
I know, Meredith, this is something that you have talked about in the past and falls kind of clearly within your portfolio. Are these issues that you're thinking about as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I really echo some of the remarks that Stella just made. It's really important to use plain language principles in designing patient labeling materials, for example, really involving patients in the design and formatting of the materials. And also there are easy tools out there. The plain language principle and toolkit is available on, for example, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control website. The patient educational materials assessment tool is another publicly available tool that you can use to assess if your material is actionable and understandable to patients. So there's a wealth of readily available information and tools to help you in this regard.
It's a complicated proposition. Sometimes saying things simply and clearly is extremely complicated, and deciding what information not to share similarly is a tough one. And I guess we'll learn how to do it better as time goes on. My next question, and Christine, I'd like your read on this initially. Then I'd like the group to kick in as well. Is when we were putting together this report, one of the issues that came up is how exactly do you define a patient or a patient citizen? And we spent a lot of time discussing that. And terminology counts. Rhetoric is important. And Elizabeth, what you said during your walkthrough of the chapters, I think was very keen, which is really is a question of putting patients in the context of everybody else within their universe and within the healthcare system more broadly. But patients are not monolithic. And oftentimes when you ask patients or patient organizations, even within the same disease space, a question, you can get radically different responses. So my question is, how do we build partnerships for patient involvement in medicine's development by focusing on a more holistic view of what a patient means, even if they don't agree with each other?
Thank you, Peter, for the question. And I think it's so important to really first collaborate very early with patients and patient organizations to really start building the partnership with these patients early enough, because it's only when you start early that you can have an impact on your drug development program. You can check in a way your assumptions, and really starting early will provide you with clear insights from the patient's perspective that you can embed in your clinical trials, in your clinical programs. Like, for example, start early co-creating or co-selecting with patients and patient organizations the endpoints that you can later on really build into your programs. If you start too late, you may still have an impact, but these changes will be cosmetics. If you start early, working and collaborating with patients will be a game changer. So include always a diverse population of patients. It's as important as this starting point, early starting point. Try always to also be very respectful of this voice of experts, as said, respecting the independence of patients, communicating openly with them, transparently, really to build up this mutual trust that will help you to design the best drug possible.
Keza, is working with patient groups a bit like herding cats? Keza?
I'm sorry, herding cats. Well, I don't think it has to be. It has to start from the idea that you're having a partnership, and every part, each partner understands exactly the expectations and responsibilities they have in the process. I think these days, to be honest, doing things without the patient voice is to me inconceivable, because increasingly the regulators and national authorities also want to see new drugs. What value do they bring to the patient? And without patients, without working in partnership, you can't do that.
I think it's important to remember what you just said, which is it's inconceivable. I think, however, to a lot of regulators, And to a lot of drug developers, it's entirely conceivable because it's something else they have to do. It's more work. They don't understand entirely the benefit. That's not the way they've been trained. Juan, what's your message to regulators out there relative to, yes, it will be more work. Yes, it will be an additional expense. Yes, you will have to hire additional staff. Is it worth it?
It is definitely, but I think it's very important what you mentioned. I think it needs to be acknowledged that it is more work. And I think it's important in order to allocate resources and to plan properly, because patient engagement doesn't happen spontaneously. And you need to really plan for it. You need to really allocate people to dedicate and work on it. And then to support the organization, which is going to engage the patients, but also to ensure that the patients have adequate support and training in order to make this engagement meaningful. And this leads to maybe another element, which I think is also very important, because when we are talking about support, we also consider financial support. And we need to ensure that patients and patient organizations remain independent, that they can still provide independent advice and support. And I think it's not necessarily a challenge, because there are many methods that has proven to be efficient in ensuring that, and they are very well described in the guidance, in the CIOMS guidance. However, they need to be guaranteed, because otherwise it can undermine the whole process.
Elizabeth, let me ask you kind of a side question to that. Is clearly, people say, well, why is this important? And it's important because you'll have less dropout in clinical trials. You'll have better recruitment mechanisms. You'll have better data to create a risk-benefit profile. But most importantly, a more robust patient voice throughout the process will enhance patient outcomes. Patients will be healthier by using healthcare products more appropriately and more efficiently. Do you think that's a message that's getting out there to the various constituencies within the healthcare ecosystem, that better patient voice drives better patient outcomes?
I would say sort of within a certain the folks who are probably calling into this webinar, the folks who contributed to the report. I think we've all got the message, and all recognize that understanding what are unmet needs of patients and addressing those unmet needs is going to get us more efficiently to better health outcomes for patients. And so I think certainly within this segment. But one point I actually wanted to go back to was what I thought was a really important one at the beginning, when you mentioned about when there's disagreement among different patients about what's important and what's important to them. And, there might be a caregiver that thinks something's important in a qualitative interview. There might be a patient who thinks something's different. And I think it's really important for us to understand how representative those discrepancies are, because I think that that's really key to making a big impact with this, is understanding, is that an unexpected insight that's coming out? And so it's important for us to address that. Or is it something where it's really just, one person thought that was important. And so while it's important to them, it's something that, across a sort of population level drug development plan, we're probably not going to be able to focus specifically on that. But I think that really goes back to Kaisa's point, and also Christine's point about the early engagement, understanding potentially what are these subpopulations that may not be defined by something biological, but maybe it's geographic. Maybe transportation to a clinical trial is really important to me, whereas for some other people it may not be. So that could be an indicator of how we want to collect data, or how frequently we want to have people coming into the clinic for visits, and so on and so forth. So I thought that was a really important point. Just wanted to amplify that as well.
Or even something as basic as letting people know that the issue of non-halal excipients in medical products is taken seriously by developers. Stella, you had your hand raised.
Thanks very much, Peter. I mean, we talked about the financial implications of involving patients, but I think we also need to mention that the financial implications if we don't involve patients, because risk minimization programs tend to be quite expensive. And if they're not working, you've just completely wasted your money. So, and you've also given us a false sense of security. So involve the patients, let them tell you what works, what doesn't work, how you can do it better, And in that way, you will get a good result and you won't just throw money into, well, the emptiness, because you have your risk minimization, which may be absolutely essential to allow your benefit risk profile of your drug to be advantageous, and also so that patients can use it safely, would just be wasted. So involve patients, involve them early, hear their voice. It's so important.
You know, Juan, I see you have your hand raised, but I also am keeping my eye on the clock. And I want to ask you a question. Gandhi said, be the change you want to see. So within EMA, what changes do you want to share with our audience to show that you are serious about making the patient voice a crucial aspect of medicine's regulation?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I think maybe I wanted to follow up on what Estela said. I think I cannot agree more. And I think that what we wanted to share is that I think everyone, let's say, is converted here. Everyone agrees that without the patient, it can be worse. You need to invest on it, but if we don't get the patient's input, the outcome is not, let's say, validated. It's not going to work the way it should. It always improves the outcome. But even if this is just the validation, even because I think sometimes we expect the patients to change the outcome. No, sometimes it doesn't change the outcome. Sometimes it just confirms that the direction is right. And I think this is where we need to acknowledge that without the patient, something is missing. And we cannot demonstrate in many different actions and activities that we have done that it is always the case.
Right. And I think that
if I may add before we finish, because we wanted to acknowledge, I mean, this effort that science colleagues have done developing this guidance, it is the first global initiative on patient engagement. And as such, I think it has a huge impact in the sense that science colleagues has managed to gather all key people around the globe working on patient engagement and make a comprehensive compilation of all the principles that I think we all apply across different areas and regions. Therefore, I think I cannot thank them enough, because I think this is such a useful tool that hopefully can be applied and can be used by many people in order to progress in this important area.
And I think in many countries, certainly in the US and in Europe, involvement of the patient voice isn't just nice or necessary, it's the law. You know, it has to be done. It has to, and that means people need to take it seriously. We're running out of time, Keza, and as the patient representative on this patient voice panel, I'd like to give you the last word. What are your final thoughts here?
Wow. Well, I think, you know, please read the guide and reflect on it and use it. It's not about one size fits all, but it's something that requires a culture change, and it requires a change in mindset. So obviously, you know, in our patient community, we will be using it. I hope regulators and companies use it, because frankly, you know, if you don't involve patients, you're not possibly doing the right things, but you're also not doing the things right. So it's only by collaborating that we will get better medicines in future that will also be used in a safe way by patients.
And taking it seriously forever.
Absolutely.
Lembit, I see that you've been listening carefully. You're the boss of everybody here. Would you like to end our panel with any incredibly savvy things to offer? You're on mute. Oh,
thank you, Peter. And in the interest of time, of course, I would like to thank you and all the panelists and speakers for the terrific work and contribution, not only today, but also during the work process of getting this CIOMS report out. And just to say that to many of the participants, thank you for participation and answering your question in advance. Yes, the materials of this webinar will be made publicly available. The recording plus also the presentations will be made publicly available. And there was also a question about the hard copies of report. I must say they're already close to running out. So those who are extremely quick may still be able to get some, ordering it through the CIOMS website, paying for the postage, because the publication itself is free. So I think we did a good milestone, but it's not the end of the story. I think all participants, all stakeholders have unfinished agendas. And as always in healthcare, you can always be better. I don't know any setting in the healthcare where you can't do better next day. So we all have unfinished agenda ahead. We can still improve things, and let's march together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lembit. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Good luck, bon courage, and I hope that you take this to heart and that the CIOMS report can help you advance the patient voice in your specific region and area of expertise. Thank you very much.